Good morning to everybody and welcome. The truth is I'm not really needed here because Lawrence and Simon are perfectly capable of navigating their way through all of this, but I was asked, so I'm doing it. And most of you know Simon very well and know his many achievements. And I'm going to say, because he won't, because he's a modest chap, that they are absolutely remarkable and they are in a very wide realm of different areas. And all achieving an incredible level of excellence. And so we're in for a treat. So again, welcome to my story. And on my script of one line here, Simon's been a very active member of the Southampton community since the early 80s, as most of you will know. Okay, Simon, you have chosen to name this talk about your life. The title you've given it is A Coat of Many Colours. So the first question for everybody and for myself is, why have you chosen that title? Where's that come from?
Well, thanks, Julie, and good morning, everybody. The title, A Coat of Many Colours, of course, comes from the story of Joseph. But in a wider sense, all our lives are effectively a jigsaw of experiences, a jigsaw of influences. Some obviously we all have different parts to that jigsaw. And when talking about our story, and by the way, mine is not the only one, I think everybody here could probably give an extremely interesting recount of their lives and their careers to date. And of course, we all go on for many years to come, but they're all made up of different parts to their jigsaw. And what I wanted to do today was to just explore some of those areas of the jigsaw that make up my own life. So it's not a CV presentation, it's not a history, it's not a month-by-month boring resume, but it is a more in-depth exploration of some of those topics. And that was also in the subtitle that was sent out earlier.
Okay. So thank you for that, for the overview, for the outline of the coat of many colours. We're going to go now into the first colour. And the first and one of the most vibrant, I think it's fair to say, colours in this coat is the realm of music. The realm of music in your life, and if I'm not mistaken, the life of your whole family. So if we could just start by saying a little bit about where that began and how that, if you'll excuse the pun, played out, and where you are with it now.
Right, this is a very broad topic for us because I think most people know that I was born into and grew up in a world of music and in fact general classical culture, more classical than the popular culture, and people react to the cultures in which they grow up either by rejecting them, but in our case, and I think in all four, that's my siblings, my three siblings have adopted that music and general culture. Some of us have made it into our professional careers. So let me just give you a little bit of background on this. First of all, about my parents. My father came to this country in 1939 at the age of 16 from Slovakia. He belonged, and we'll be touching on this a little bit later on, from what we would now call a Haredi household, although in those days, Haredim had a much broader view of the world than they do, I think, anyway, from observation that they do today. And the observation, as you'll see, still comes very much from part of my family on his side. But he came in 1939 at the age of 16 and landed up in Gateshead Yeshiva in the 1940s, which is a very interesting place. But as he was a foreigner who'd come to this country, he had to register and report every single week to the local police station in Gateshead. And later on, when he came to London, he continued his learning until towards the end of the war. And immediately after the war, he was working in part with Dr. Schonfeld. It was really not working for Dr. Schonfeld, the fabled Rabbi Dr. Schonfeld, who rescued so many children in Europe. But he was doing some voluntary work for him. A charity concert that he organized in 1946 led to a career from 1946 onwards of presenting concerts, initially popular concerts, and in London. It wasn't long before he was bringing Bruno Walter, the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, which was quite an achievement for a young person who'd grown up in Slovakia with no background in music whatsoever, but had taken to it like fish to water. And well, that was in the late 1940s. He put on quite a stunning array of concerts before he met my mother at Dr. Schonfeld's office. My mother, I would say my father was born in Slovakia. And we went back, been back a couple of times with the family to his birthplace where we explored. And my mother refuses to go back to her birthplace on principle. And when people ask me, what's the principle, what is that birthplace? I tell them that it's Bethnal Green. Bethnal Green was where it was, it's not such a joke these days because Bethnal Green, as you know, is quite a extremely gentrified area, but in those days it wasn't particularly salubrious. And my mother worked her way out of it, even during the war as a young teenager. She started the war at the age of 13, 12, and she was evacuated but came back to London very soon afterwards at the beginning of the war, and worked from the age of 12 or 13 right the way through the war, during the Blitz, and after the war, as I say, during the 1940s, she eventually joined Dr. Schonfeld's office to work there and met my father. And when they got married in 1949, immediately, and I mean immediately, their honeymoon was in Birmingham because there was a show going on in Birmingham, which my father was putting on. She joined his business. She did many other things, but I was born in the 1950s into a world where they were already well established in the music life of this country. They both, or my father initially, they both had introduced the notion of popular Sunday evening concerts. During the war, evening concerts were rare. So the reintroduction, and indeed the introduction of popular Sunday evening concerts, was a tremendous attraction to the public in the late 1940s. But the big change in their career came, and I hop over quite a lot, in the 1953, when my father went to Russia at about the time of Stalin's death. Could be corrected. I think it was slightly before Stalin died. And he was very anxious to build, to bring over some of the famous names that were known in the West, but not been seen in the West. The Oistrachs, Rostropovich, the cellist, who was very young at the time, Gilels, Oistrachs, I mentioned earlier, Richter, Sviatoslav Richter, the great pianist. These were names that were very well known, and again, a lot of stories there, but in the 1950s, and in the early 1960s, he started bringing these together with my mother, these wonderful musicians to the United Kingdom. So for my earliest memories, growing up in Golders Green, we'll talk a little bit about the religious background there, I thought it was quite normal for everybody in Golders Green to mix with some of the most famous musicians in the world, but clearly later on discovered that was not the case. And when I say mix with them, this was not just attending these concerts, but because there was this iron curtain that divided these musicians and their families from the West. When they came over here, they became almost part of our own family. These were people who came to our home, who met us regularly, more socially, and who we got to know personally. And certainly they were part of my parents' family, some more than others. But it was very important for them to have this home, if you like, not just a place where they could present concerts in the West. These were remarkable achievements, and I want to perhaps show a few pictures here, just if I can do this share screening, which is not so easy. Whilst I'm talking, I shall just bring these up. Okay. Sorry for the gap, but it's quite difficult to control these Zoom things. But one of the people, the two of the people that my father and mother were particularly close to were the Oistrachs. And you can see here an early picture of my father standing, this was before a concert, I believe the festival hall, with David Oistrach on the right, his son Igor Oistrach. David is holding a viola, and they were about to perform Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante. And this was a picture this remains a picture very dear to my mother. My father, up to his death last year, always displayed this in his office, and this is a picture that we show regularly. We're making presentations of this period. Both the Oistrachs, in particular David Oistrach, were in effect members of our family. David Oistrach, I remember very clearly in my early teens, because he died in 1974 when I was already in my early 20s. Getting to know him, he came a lot to this country. If I just stop the share there, and he came a lot to this country. And I remember very closely in 1972 when I was in Holland with my mother, and we met Oistrach there. He was giving a series of concerts, mostly the Mozart concertos with the English Chamber Orchestra, Mozart violin concertos, and got to know him and his wife very, very well, and all sorts of stories around that. And so it was with other musicians. My mother was particularly close to Sviatoslav Richter, and also, there was a picture I had prepared, but I can't seem to see it now on my screen, a beautiful picture of my mother who had in tour with Sviatoslav Richter, the famous pianist, The reason she was in Tours, he was appearing in a festival there, and Richter avoided air travel. He would feel quite comfortable nowadays, but he avoided air travel because he just had a fear of air travel. When he had to, for example, to Japan, he had to, but in general, he liked to travel by road and rail. And my mother had to go to places to collect him and bring him back to this country. And that was one of the conditions, difficult conditions under which Richter would appear in this country. And she was in Tours, for example, where he loved to appear in these little festivals, a festival in Tours in France before coming here. He also, by the way, loved to appear at the Aldeburgh Festival. He was very friendly with Benjamin Britten, and they had a close association. Indeed, he preferred appearing there than at the festival hall. And so my parents organized concerts, small concerts and recitals in places like that. I'd like to bring up a picture here of, involves me, if I could find it. So I don't know if you can see that. So I shall share it. This is a picture, I think you can see it, of my father on the left, my mother second from the right, and myself on the right, together with Rudolf Nureyev. Now, from the early 60s, I had prepared a poster from the early 60s, indeed even late 50s, but the early 60s in particular. My parents started bringing the big ballet companies, the Bolshoi Ballet and the Kirov Ballet from Russia, and that remains true to this very day. And Nureyev was a major star with the Kirov Ballet, and in 1961, my parents brought the Kirov Ballet over. They'd been appearing in Paris, and they were due to fly from Paris to London in 1961, when Nureyev here famously jumped the barrier. So he actually jumped the barrier on his way from Paris to my parents' performances. I have some newsreels, which again in the future I hope to show. Wonderful news was my father standing at the base of the aircraft steps with lots of journalists who wanted to find out what was happening. Of course, Nureyev, as they say in Joseph's story, Hayele Denenu, the child wasn't there. Poor Nureyev, well, lucky Nureyev, he jumped the barrier, but the performances had to go on without him. Later on, by the way, when my parents had a break for a period with the Russians in 1970s, Nureyev, if I can just stop that screen, sorry to keep butting in, but yeah, there we are. Nureyev appeared regularly for my parents. I believe it was 13, possibly more, annual appearances at the Festival of Nureyev. This gives you some idea of the background of my early life, where I was very involved in my parents' work and sopped it up. Maybe I can share just one or two more photographs in this context. Here's a lovely picture, which I will share, taken by Anthony Armstrong-Jones, Lord Snowdon. There's my father there, and actually that's Mikhail Baryshnikov with his foot on my father's left shoulder, and not one that our rabbi at the time might have appreciated, but it's a great one. Lord Snowdon is actually on the left-hand side. He'd obviously set this picture to take with a time lapse, and stop that. Sure there's a way of actually creating a show, but I haven't yet discovered it. And some of the productions brought us into touch. This is later on. I want to show a picture. Some of us brought us into touch with some of the famous people of the day. So I have some difficulty. Okay, I shall talk on, and hopefully I'll be able to bring that up.
Yeah, maybe at the end, if you.
So, I'm having some difficulty in bringing up some of these photographs. However,
we have playing the violin.
We have me, unfortunately not today, but I will in the future, because I've actually taken it up again. Violin playing, music playing for all of us was very important. My sister SHtory, she plays the piano and the cello, and she has actually made that a career. The piano, she teaches piano, but she's also very much involved with the music life of Israel, where she now lives. This is the work with Hasabna, the music school. She's also involved with my mother in the business of presenting. She prepares programs, but we've all made music part of our lives. And I actually stopped playing the violin for a period after university, and only recently have taken it up again. And this lockdown has given me the opportunity to start to focus a lot on that. And it's very important because also not only playing, but also going to concerts. Concerts has featured a lot in my life. I know some of the people here I often see at Wigmore Hall, at least I saw at Wigmore Hall, and I hope to see again very shortly at Wigmore Hall, which is a wonderful venue. I think in London we are enriched with the pop, with the culture, with the music, probably more than any other city in the world. We have the best musicians, we have the best, of course. We also have other arts. My parents continue to this very day to produce the great ballet presentations at Covent Garden. Indeed, my father died in March, and I always have a lovely picture in my mind of him in bed in hospital a few days before he unfortunately passed away, and he was studying the box office returns for last summer's Bolshoi season. So he was certainly, his mind was very, very much in it. And my mother, working together with him on the season, carried it alone in what I have to say, and she may not agree with me, but I think was the greatest season that we have had in every sense of the word. It was a wonderful season in tribute to my father at Covent Garden last year. Many of you may well have been there. There was due to be a ballet production here of the Canadian National Ballet Company this year at Covent Garden, but unfortunately that's had to be cancelled. But my mother in her early 90s, who by the way is watching today, will continue, I really hope, in many years to come, putting on these productions, and there are plans for next year and the year after with, again, the Mariinsky, as they're now called, the Kirov is now called the Mariinsky Ballet. So I think, as you can see, I've waxed lyrical about this whole area of music because it's been a key feature of my life. Julie.
Okay, so I know, as you're talking, I'm also aware that a whole other dimension of your musical life is also encompassed within your own singing within a choir, within more than one choir, but perhaps we're not intending to go there today. Maybe that's for another story. And we'll move on now to next.
You can see that. It's Shabbaton Choir on video, especially one that's been downloaded over 3 million times. We sang in a tribute to Israel's 60th birthday with the chief rabbi then, Lord Sachs. That was the Ose Shalom. Well worth a visit because it was very beautifully professionally produced. But yes, the Shabbaton Choir was another feature.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So you've given us a wonderful sort of flavour of the extent to which your early life and your continued life and that of your whole family was so steeped in classical music. But I would say absolutely on a par with that, perhaps if not more, well, definitely on a par, is the way in which your family was steeped in Judaism and religious life and learning. Your brothers, you talked about your father having been at Gateshead in one form or another, in one capacity, and all of you having gone to, let's put it this way, not slouch yeshivas, shall we say. So can you tell us a little bit about the family's background and your background in terms of Judaism and your role in the United Synagogue, but right from the beginning, because you talked about the sort of, not dissonance, but perhaps unusualness of this family very much ensconced in a professional music world, and yes, also in the very full life of Golders Green and Stieblach and shuls in the area. And it was a little bit unusual. Where did that all happen? How did it happen?
Well, as I said earlier, my father did come from that background, and my mother also from an observant background in the East End. And it was very important for them that we should grow up in a world which was truly observant, whilst at the same time they and we were exposed to this much wider world of national figures as well as the great musicians. And we belonged at the time to not just Golders Green, but we belonged to the Hendon Adas Shul, and indeed for a period earlier than that belonged to Reb Huna. Some of you will know Reb Huna. This is the Stiebel in Golders Green. So you can imagine now these worlds coming together, which we were growing up in. And that's important because we had a very modern Orthodox, that is to say, a very in the age approach to Judaism, but we belonged very much during that time to what is now roughly referred to as the more Haredi end of the community. And that meant learning a lot. Learning was very important. My parents made sure that all of us had a very solid Jewish education from a very young age. My first exposure to Talmud, to Gemara, was at the age of 9. Indeed, my first exposure to Jewish education was the school I first went to, which amazingly enough was a school called Pardes House. Pardes House still exists, and I used to learn from Chumash, from Hebrew to Yiddish. Weil dabei schert man gesucht the Kinder. Now these were two languages I didn't understand, so I was translating effectively from one language I didn't understand to another language I didn't understand, but actually the Yiddish has stayed with me, and that's important because we were also, interestingly enough, at Party's house, given a strong secular education. They, for some reason, believed in strong secular alongside very, very strong Limudei Kodesh. And I was able to carry that through later on when I went to secondary school. I actually went to Hasmonean Primary School for a few years. Secondary school, I went to Haberdashers, as you can imagine. That was quite a culture change from Party's house. An Anglican school, school of the Church of England, but public school, some of you may well have been there. And the reason I raise that is that whilst what was going on, still very much part of the Jewish religious life of Golders Green. I went to the Ezra Youth Movement, which for a period later on I ran, but I also went to an organization called Pirchim, which was part of the Aguda, and that really is hard Haredi stuff. And we would go to Stamford Hill on Motzei Shabbat from Malava Malka and sing Vantus Rifo, we want to eat more, Hevav, Zayin, Ches, Pirchim is the best. And then Monday morning we turn up at Haberdashers singing Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven. And it was this amalgamation of two and more worlds that I think colored all my life. Certainly that of my siblings, and there was this national life, the music life, the religious life, the educational life. Haberdashers gave me a tremendous education, but I never ever separated from, and indeed others there, it's become an increasing feature of now these schools, but in those days it was very rare for people to go home early on a Friday afternoon. We were unshaking in our approach to religious practice. Later on, I went to Gateshead Yeshiva, where again, I think there are one or two people who I can certainly see Emmanuel. I think Emmanuel was at Gateshead Yeshiva. Very few Gateshead Yeshiva Bochrim at South Hampstead. So we have a little group of people who studied again in Yiddish. But I would nip off every now and again to Edinburgh to see the Edinburgh Festival. The Rabbonim at the time didn't know. I have to tell you a little vignette there. There was a mashgiach, that is to say, a major rabbi who looked after the moral behavior of the Yeshiva Bachurim. A wonderful man, actually, Rav Moshe Schwab, but he decided to give a shiur on general behavior or general culture, I suppose you would call it, before Pesach one year. The year when I was there was 1970. He gave a shiur in which he said, Alle Bochum sollen wissen, dass Musik ist a Schmutz, which was to say that all the boys should now know that all music, that's the whole of Western music, is filth. I mean, he'd obviously listened to Bach, to Beethoven, to Schubert, to Brahms, to Shostakovich, and he dismissed this as, well, schmutz. He then said, Bilder sind eine Schmutz. I presume by that he had gone to every music art gallery in the world. He'd reviewed the great artists at the time, Bilder of pictures, and having examined it all, he had dismissed that as schmutz. Bicher, books, he'd looked at Western literature and reviewed the books of the great authors of the age and from going back in history. And having read this marvelous library, he decided this was all a schmutz. So the whole of Western culture was a schmutz. Now, we didn't take this too seriously, as you can imagine. We were very much involved in culture, whilst at the same time being in yeshiva. And I love that ability to be able to, as they say, dance at two and more chasanas. And that's something that I've carried throughout. I later went on to study, and this really takes us into an area of science. So my university education. So Julie, I'll hand back to you.
We're moving towards the sort of midway point of Simon's very colourful life. And the next element, the next threads of his coat of many colours bring us to science and technology, which you just mentioned. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that from Habs there was possibly a period at Imperial, possibly a period at Weizmann, straddling different countries and different disciplines. Simon, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about how that all started and where it took you.
Science wasn't something that grabbed me in the early days of haberdashers. I just didn't get it, and especially mathematics. But I had a teacher in my third form, a man named Mr. Hewitt, Wilf Hewitt, we called him, I suppose that must have been his name, but Wilf, was my teacher of mathematics. And for some reason, he excited me in maths in a way that had not grabbed me up to that point. And with maths, those of you who understand and like maths, you realize it puts science generally into perspective. Mathematics underlies so much of what we do, so much of what we're seeing today is you have mathematics at the heart of modeling. epidemiology, but I could name just about, I would ask anybody to study some mathematics because it puts a frame of reference to anything you study, and certainly of the sciences. And I went to Imperial College to study physics and took an undergraduate degree there, and then stayed on to do a postgraduate degree in mathematical physics, which is mainly the mathematics of physics, particularly in the area of nuclear physics. So my doctorate from Imperial College in 1979 was a doctorate in the mathematics of nuclear physics. But I didn't want to slot myself into that area, so I moved away within physics to the area of fiber optics and optical communication, which was beginning to burgeon. Obviously, now it's part of our daily lives, optical fibers. In those days, it was very much in the laboratory, and I moved to Israel for a few years to do a postdoctoral fellowship at the Weizmann Institute. A wonderful time of my life, I can tell you, because knowing that I wasn't going to pursue an academic career, I wasn't under enormous pressure to work too much in the laboratory or to publish papers, but I did. I published papers there with a number of colleagues, but I was able to also do a lot of traveling at the time. Amazingly enough, people don't realize this was the early, well, in the 70s, I was already working as an undergraduate and postgraduate at the Weizmann Institute, and I was flying from Israel direct to Iran. You could get an El Al flight to Tehran, a daily flight, but traveling generally during the period of the 70s when I worked as a postgraduate at the Weizmann Institute, more importantly as a postdoctoral fellowship in 1979 to 81, I was able to travel a lot, as well as see Israel, feel Israel, and get to know Israel. I taught courses there, and that was quite difficult because some of the courses had to be taught in Ivrit, so it taught me the language skills that I was able to use later on in Israel. It was a fascinating topic, again, a whole area in itself of optical fibers, how that's developed over the last 30, 40 years, and lasers and the use of that. We did a lot of work in holography for information storage. But I always knew that whatever career I pursued after that would involve technology. Technology was so exciting then, as it is today. As we can see, this is a very early version zoom of what we're going to be seeing over the next few years. One can see it'll be a lot easier and a lot more attractive. So there's so much to do in technology, and certainly that shaped everything I did thereafter.
As we can see, somebody who's a massive underachiever, with his doctorate in mathematics of nuclear physics, along teaching in other languages and flying around the world and holography and fiber optics and all the rest of it. But not to stand still, the next colour in this coat of many colours, and one which I know is incredibly strong in the whole family, and as Simon has mentioned, is the home of more than one of his siblings, and central to his parents' life and to his is Israel. Simon, can you tell us a little bit again of where that started from and how you've travelled through and where you are today with that?
Israel, well, Israel is not even my second home. I think, like a lot of you, I do feel Israel is my first home. I love England. I love living in Britain. It's wonderful. I don't reject it in any way. But I'm so at home in Israel. My connection to Israel started, physical connection to Israel started actually before the Six-Day War in 1966, when I went to the then much smaller Israel than we have today. I went to the Mandelbaum Gate and in Jerusalem to the border with Jordan. And it was a very different Israel. It was in many senses a more innocent Israel, an Israel which was just being introduced later on to television. But the Six-Day War did change a lot. And in 1968, the whole family went for Pesach to Israel. Again, it was still very early days after the Six-Day War. And there was a rawness about it, but I do remember Israel television coming on, and they forgot to give the credits for a film. So the guy said, the introducer said, well, actually, I forgot to introduce this film, so I'm starting again. It was that type of wonderful amateur approach to just about everything that went on this would have been late 60s. However, my real connections with Israel started in the 70s when I started going to the Weizmann Institute, both as an undergraduate at the undergraduate school there for the summers, and later on continued that as a postgrad, and then took up this fellowship to work and live in Rehovot. Science, by the way, is not only part of my life, science is part of my brother's life, Daniel. Many of you know Daniel. Daniel is an oncologist, a professor of oncology. He has pursued science alongside his medical world. There is a difference. He has a laboratory where he does medical research. He's quite a rare phenomenon in being both a PhD, having a PhD, from Oxford University, and also practicing medicine at University College Hospital, so he's able to span both worlds. And worked recently at the Weizmann Institute himself. In fact, his daughter is there doing herself a master's degree and expects to do a doctorate. So you can see that line has continued there. In Israel, my parents bought a home. I shouldn't say a home, it was actually 4 broken down hovels in what was then a very broken down area, Yemim Moshe, in, I believe it was 1974, just after the 73 war. And we started, it was renovated, the houses were renovated, put together to create a lovely home. And that became our home in Jerusalem, in Rehov Tura, to this day. We have this home to this day in Israel. It allowed us a place to stay, to live, to engage with people, to build friends. Indeed, my brother Mark went on Aliyah in the late 1970s. Mark joined the Foreign Office. Actually, he went into the army first, joined the Foreign Office, became a diplomat, worked his way up through the diplomatic service, became ultimately the ambassador of Israel in Ireland, subsequently in India during a very difficult period, the Mumbai massacres, but also a fascinating period for all of us to be able to go see him there, and is currently the Israeli ambassador in Australia. He's changed his name to Mark Sofer, so he's not known as Mark Hochhauser. We are descended, I mentioned the religious part earlier on, we're descended from the Khatam Sofer. He wanted to change his name to something with a family connection, so changed his name to Mark Sofer. So our connections in Israel are enormous. And then, of course, we mentioned earlier my sister in music. She moved to Israel in the early 1980s with her very young family at the time, 5 children. I wonder if somebody has come on.
Yeah, Charles has come on.
Yes, there we are. Charles, if you can just mute, that'd be marvelous. Yeah, I'll do this. I'm going to mute Charles. There we are.
I don't think anyone can do that.
That's a little Charles, man. Anyway, so she went on and in fact, her family grew up in Israel. They grew up and married and all have children. So she has now, I believe, 24 Israeli grandchildren with whom we're all exceedingly close. My mother's great-grandchildren, my father till his death had a wonderful, warm connection with his great-grandchildren in Israel. This was a family connection. So regular visits, long before even people in this country started going regularly to Israel, building homes there. One where we knew the language, have friends there. My parents presented concerts there for many, many years. Got to know some of the key personalities there. Unfortunately, I can't bring some lovely pictures up, but we became very close friends with President Navon while still in office. Indeed, when he left office, he lived for 9 months in our home, because amazingly enough, he had nowhere to live after leaving office. So he and his wife, the late Ophira Navon, came to live in our house there. We were very close to Teddy Kollek, the then mayor of Jerusalem, plus many, many people who were involved in the music life of Israel, the critics, the orchestras, the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. To this day, my my parents have been bringing the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra to this country. Very close to Zubin Mehta, their principal conductor, until last October, I believe. So science, living, home, everything connected to Israel, and a passion for Israel and everything that it stands for. Not necessarily in all of its politics, but a passion for Israel, and much of my communal life has been involved with, as we all do, defending Israel, its right to exist and its security, which is so dear to us.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so coming to our penultimate colour in your coat of many colours, we've already heard about the many ways in which these different threads are all sewn together. The next that we're coming to is the world of business, in which I know certainly about a few of your incredible ventures, and I know that certainly you were a man ahead of your time in terms of the technology and the models that you were bringing to the world. Perhaps you can tell us some of that. First of all, what you've done over the years, and also about the projects which I know that you're now running in lockdown from home and working very hard on at the present moment.
Okay, Julie, this is a story in itself in my business career. I left postdoc and decided to leave academia and jump in the deep end. I found a job as a junior at Lehman Brothers, of blessed memory, or maybe unblessed memory, in New York. So I went to live in New York. Again, a big change in my life, working at a firm which was a very aggressive firm. I didn't realize how aggressive till I actually joined it, in an area that I didn't have absolutely no knowledge. I couldn't read a balance sheet, I couldn't read a P&L statement. I was a scientist. And this is really where science and mathematics in particular come in, the analytical approach to solving problems. And I think second or third day at Lehman, I was called into their corporate finance group, and I remember Mr. Alan Kaplan, a very senior and aggressive investment banker, said, Hochhauser, that's me, Hochhauser wants you to work out the basis point difference attributable to the tax treatment of deep discount bonds. And I'm sure a few people on this call, I didn't understand a word of that sentence. But actually, if you look at the sentence, it can be analyzed in some detail. What is a bond? How does it operate? What is the deep discount bond, where bonds pay out coupons? I want to go bore people with the details of this, but you can take a very analytical approach to a problem. And for some reason, within days, I became something of well, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I knew a little bit about deep discount bonds and their pricing. The tax treatment, by the way, was capital gains taxes against income tax, treatment of the coupon, and also the issuer. So it meant a differential in pricing. There were a lot of physicists, by the mathematicians, working then on Wall Street, creating vehicles that actually their own bosses didn't understand. As we know, the world got into a bit of a mess over that. But at that time, it was still new, and I rather enjoyed working there. It was a very, very pressured environment. I worked in their corporate finance, then subsequently in the mergers and acquisitions group, but concentrated very solidly on technology companies. So there was always that technology angle. And then I was called, we had a close family connection with Jacob Rothschild, now Lord Rothschild, who wanted to set up a venture capital fund in the early 1980s. I had moved back briefly to Israel to set up a venture capital fund for Leumi. Venture capital was very new in the early 80s, 83, 84, funding of early stage companies. But Rothschild wanted very much to set one up in this country and crazily invited me to set up what became the St. James's Venture Capital Fund, where we backed early stage, very early stage companies. We were active, I was active with my colleagues in building the companies in the 1980s here in the United Kingdom, and more passive, but still part of investment groups in the United States. Very many companies in all areas, telecommunications, I mentioned earlier, my own interest in telecoms, software, and these were the early days of the burgeoning venture capital and startup industries, both here and obviously in the United States. Took me to Silicon Valley quite a lot, and exposure to the world that we're now much more familiar with, but in those days, again, a much more esoteric world. I got, with about 10 years after that, in 1992, I got a little bit bored with being involved peripherally with other people's companies. I want to start my own company. And I think what you were referring to earlier, Julie, which is a whole long story in itself, was an idea I had, which was what we now know as the video on. This was in 1992, 93, and started working out, set up a business called VideoNet, Video Networks Limited, and started with one person, with myself, in a room in Buckingham Street in London, building up the idea of how would it be possible to watch any movie or any broadcast, any program at any time and control our viewing. It's exactly what we do nowadays with Netflix. And gradually my company built up from me in the room to 700 of us, in fact, getting finance for a company that had areas of production. We launched in a very small way in the late 1990s over a very nascent BT broadband network. But interestingly, I had deals with every single Hollywood studio. We had an office in California. That meant we could provide something like a library of 5,000 movies, even larger than well, I'm not sure if it's larger now than Netflix, but certainly in those days, these Hollywood studios were not providing to anybody else for video on demand, so we're happy to cooperate with me. We had to invent the technology. That's literally everything. There was no cloud technology in those days, so it meant building the servers. I think David Turner's on the call. David, and I can see David there is waving to me. David and I, we did a video on demand of, he was then working with LA Fitness. We did together a thing which we called Amazon Health and Fitness, David, if you remember, and almost got, well, we did get into trouble. We've got a warning from Amazon, which was not known in this country at the time, and we backed off. But Amazon Health and Fitness was a very early health and fitness video on demand service. But there were other areas. I was introducing home shopping, but the primary center of what became Home Choice TV was films on demand, very constrained at that time. My problem, unfortunately at the time, was that we were like the bride all dressed up but nowhere to go, because BT was very, very slow. Some of you will recall in the late 1990s introducing broadband, and much as I could try and convince them at the most senior level, that's chief executive and chairman level, that not only was it important, it was the future of BT. They didn't get it. They felt that their networks were already clapped out, and they felt it was necessary to concentrate on mobile and the internationalization of their brand name. So we had to sell the company early on, and it's now part of TalkTalk TV. But it was, in fact, the world's first true video on demand service, able to run what you see on Netflix now in 1997. So people say I was ahead of my time. I don't know. I think it was possible in those days. But there's one thing I've learned, whether in any form of life, and I'm sure others will agree, you must not look back. You must look forward. Always move on. If you look back, you spend your time wallowing in what could have been. And that's been very important for me. And as you rightly say, I've gone on, Julie, I've gone on to found new companies, and I'm in the process of building a very interesting company at the moment, which is an app-driven company for businesses, allowing them to give their own employees second and third phones using the cellular networks. It's called PIP Call, PIP, phone in a phone. That's being expanded quite rapidly, and we're working very nicely from home right now. And it's lucky that we have the technologies to do so. I've also founded other companies and sold those, but we don't need to go into the details now.
So for anybody who has been joining us over the last few minutes, just to say we are almost coming towards the end of Simon Hochhauser's Coat of Many Colours. Just to let you know, when we do come to our concluding part of the coat, Simon's agreed to take questions from anybody in the room. I've got one question at the end, but before we do that, we're coming remarkably to the fact that given all the strands of Simon's life, he has also managed to contribute a massive amount, as we know already, to South Hampstead, but way beyond South Hampstead and our individual community, to the whole of Anglo Jewry for sure, within the United Synagogue, within so many different areas of Jewish life, of communal life. My question relates to how that was possible, but we'll come back to that at the end. Simon, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit, we know, other than your example from home, which started very early, about communal contribution, being your parents and the rest of your family presenting you with role models, and vice versa. How did your communal activity begin? And if you can just take us through a few of the major milestones, because there have been so many, without wanting to sound whatever the word is that can't come into my head right now. Just tell us a little bit about your communal world and life in the Jewish community.
Well, as you say, Julie, it's rooted in, and many of us will come from homes where communal contribution is not an if. You have to do it. It's not even a question we ask ourselves. We contribute to our community. We've grown up in a community. We don't have to be in any way proud of what we've done, because we're supposed to do that. That's what being part of a kehillah is all about. I walked into South Hampstead a few months after Shlomo joined. It was an empty shul. We were rattling around in there. To me, growing up in Golders Green and that more yeshiva world, the United Synagogue was, how shall I phrase it? It was, well, not quite treif, but you sort of stepped in there and were very, very polite. I have cousins, my Haredi cousins say, how are you? You belong United Synagogue? Very nice, very nice. This was sort of the attitude that we had from the Adas towards the United Synagogue, a sort of a very patronizing attitude. And then I walked into this shul at South Hampstead, which I didn't realize was not an exemplar of United Synagogue at the time, where anything went. I believe one of the rules that Shlomo had for staying on as rabbi, and David would be able to confirm this, was, frankly, the rules and bylaws of the United Synagogue don't apply here. We're going to build the shul. David was really the progenitor of what we have right now. I mean, he was fantastic. He was the most active at the time. It was, David would agree, a really, really fun time to be part of the shul in 1984. But Shlomo came, and I don't know whether he broke every rule. He just ignored or didn't even know what the rules were. And as a result of that iconoclastic approach to community building, we have what South Hampstead is today. I can absolutely say that the rule breaking and therefore molding the community around the characters of the people who make up the community, rather than some esoteric and some crazy set of bylaws that have been phrased by some pompous people at a center somewhere, is the best way to build a community. And if you look at the United Synagogue's successful communities, including, by the way, that of Shlomo's own son at Bronsbury, it is the community that has been built around the character of the people there. Very, very different from our shul, and all the successful ones are different from each other. And so it became natural during the 80s and early 90s that I got very involved in the life of the shul. I was on the board and organized many of the social activities. I think, Julie, you were very involved in those days with us when we were doing the Purim spiels, which were very raw and wonderful things to be involved in. Again, we probably upset a lot of people outside, some of the high people in Jewish society, but that's the way it is and the way it will always be. But I realized that wouldn't it be good if the rest of the United Synagogue could effectively throw off its shackles and become, each community have a character of its own. So I got more and more involved with activities at the center of the United Synagogue. To cut a very long story short, towards the end of the 1990s, I became a vice president I'm an honorary officer of the United Synagogue. I started out at a very fraught period because the United Synagogue had gone through in the early 90s a very tough period of almost bankruptcy. In fact, I believe it was bankrupt. Mismanagement, scandals on the books. Again, I could talk about that at length. We inherited that. And it was a matter of getting the house in order. The Charity Commission had put the United Synagogue under a spotlight. And I have to say that under Elkin Levy, who I came in under, and then Peter Sheldon, my predecessor, 6 years, we turned the ship round. It's now an extremely solvent organization. Much of it was to do with reining in a lot of the activities. In fact, Seymour Sederman had started that process before we even came on the scene. And we have a lot to owe to Seymour, so I might as well say that here. But we were able to take opportunities. But I had this idea that we could somehow change the United Synagogue and even its rabbinate, dare I say, and even its institutions. For a period, I was also president of the board of SHtory for about a year and a half. That is a wonderful story in itself. It was the 250th anniversary of the London board of SHtory, where I put on a dinner, and I discovered the butchers boycotted my dinner. And when we looked up the history of the London board of SHtory, we discovered that in 50 years earlier, they boycotted the previous dinner. So we went ahead without them. But they're actually wonderful people, butchers. They work really, really hard. It's just that they're very difficult people to work with. So the board of SHtory was an area in the community that I worked. But then I became a president of the United Synagogue in, I believe it was 2005, for 6 years, 2 terms, until 2011. We freed up a lot of the United Synagogue thinking at the center. We gave rabbis, there was a lot of problems with rabbanim. Their packages were very poor. We started to build that up, and we gave them much more freedom to express themselves, which was frustrating to some of the older rabbanim, but we encouraged. I got to know them each in their homes, made a point of that, and started a process which I think continues to this day, where the United Synagogue is still a long way to go, but it's much more open. People ask me, did I achieve what I wanted to achieve at the United Synagogue? I say I probably achieved about 5% of what I set out to achieve, but even that hopefully is an achievement in terms of culture. When you're trying to move a big organization from where it was, and I discovered this at BT, it takes more than one person to actually change it, even if you're at the so-called top. One of the things I changed at United Synagogue was I didn't run it. It wasn't my job. I was running my businesses at the time. My job was to act as chair of the board and actually be separate from the day-to-day running. That was something different from my predecessors. I'm not skilled to do it, and I was not elected to do that. And that's continued to this day. They have a wonderful set now of executives under their chief executive, who run the organization in a very efficient way. I've subsequently joined the Board of Deputies and been quite a key member of the Finance and Organization Committee of the Board of Deputies, and up to recently with David Katz, I don't know if he's on this call, but we co-chaired Mila UK with the defense of Brit Mila. We set that up. David continues working with Johnny Arkush and the board on that. I retired from that last year. So there's never a dull moment as far as community is concerned, and it's always trying to change attitudes. If there were no new things to do, I wouldn't do it.
Simon, okay, I think most of us sitting here are exhausted, just listening to all of that. What we're going to do now is to open up to questions at the end of Simon Hochhauser's coat of many colors, my story. I have one question. I've asked you it before once when we were involved on a work project together, and that was to do with how on earth you manage to encompass so many different areas in what seems to be an incredibly efficient and effective way. I remember one of your answers at the time was that you're very good at delegation, and I have to admit that having been on the receiving end of your delegation, I know that to be true, because I remember going away with, how did that happen? But that is a very, very, very tiny aspect of somebody who, as we've all heard, has just achieved an incredible amount in so many areas. Many of us struggle with our to-do list on a regular basis, which is a modest to-do list. So very, very first question before we open it up, how do you do what you do? What do you think enables you to achieve in those areas to the extent that you do?
Well,
Don't be modest, I'm talking about your methodology, let's put it that way.
Well, as you pointed out, Julie, delegation is extremely important. There's massive room in the world for people who focus on detail. And there is a partnership between people who focus on the absolute detail of a job getting done and people who might want to take a larger picture and step back. And where you run into danger is where people who are good at the bigger picture try to step in and control the detail. I mentioned the United Synagogue earlier. It was not my job nor my skill set to be able to do run any of the features, but it was my job to remind people of the policies that we have in general to which they should work to. And I think delegation is a skill set that you have to adopt if you really want to be involved in a wide range of activities. And you need to be excited by what you do. You need to be extremely excited. So if you get bored, people tell me I'm very bored. Some people tell me they're very bored during this current period. I don't know how. There's so much to do. There's so much to watch. There's so many courses on offer. There's so many things to engage with the shul. But if you do get bored, then I'm afraid that you're lost. You must go at every subject you do with a passion. You must, if you can, delegate. It's very rare to have people who can both take on the detail as well as be able to be successful in all fields. I would say this, but my mother's able to do that, funnily enough, but she works on unbelievable detail when putting on the seasons, the ballet seasons, everything, the coaches, the transportation, the hotels. She goes and visits the hotels, but at the same time, she's able to stand back and put on those seasons. It's very, very rare. In my business, I have people who work with me and for me who have particular skill sets. Often I find my time encouraging them to know a little bit about what other people are doing and not to stay in a silo. We all are in silos, and much of what I do is and in fact I told this to the Rabbanim of the United Synagogue, we've become much more siloed than we used to be. Children grow up in a Jewish education and a Jewish world, and they don't mix with the outer world, and that's become extremely encouraging. There's no fear of being able to mix our silos, our lives, the different aspects of our life. We're richer for it, and we're stronger for it. So I think those really are the key elements. Know your limitations, persevere. It's very important to persevere. It never goes right all the time. Most of the time it goes wrong. And if you have to, delegate. When you delegate.
Thank you so much, Simon, just because I'm aware of the time, I think what I want to do is I'm going to bow out graciously now, and you have host position to ask anybody to invite them to pose their questions to you in the remaining time. So Simon, over to you, and thank you so much on behalf of South Hampstead and all of us here for that incredible SHtory. Thank you.
Thank you very much for moderating that conversation. We've gone half an hour over that part of the talk today. So if Lawrence, you can unmute and tell me whether we can go on. We're now up to the hour. I'm happy to go on.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm very happy to go on. I've got another meeting at 4 o'clock. So as long as we finish the talk, I'm happy to sit here and talk until then. No, look, I'm sure there must be some questions. I've got a question. I mean, my view, you sort of answered it just before at the end, but this enormous leap that you made when you went from haberdashers to Gateshead. I mean, that's sort of a Bob Beamon long jump leap for me. And I'm a Husbandian boy, but from Habs to Gateshead, was there a time when there was a fork in the road for you of which direction? Because you see, for me, I find not only is it important for us to be part of the cultural world and what's on offer, but I think it's very important for the non-Jewish world to see, certainly at a younger age, to mix with Jewish people. And I'm concerned, as I think I mentioned to you, that with so many Jewish kids going to Jewish schools, it's depriving the non-Jewish world of mixing with Jewish children. I mean, I was in front of a group of 100 non-Jewish kids from Hendon School, which is like Hendon County, and I realized that none of them had Jewish friends, and none of them had been into a Jewish house for tea. I wonder what your view on that is.
Well, it's an enormous subject in its own right. First of all, to answer the first part of your question, when I was at Haberdashers, and I mentioned this earlier, my parents insisted, and we were quite happy to have a very, very full, not just Jewish life, but Jewish education. So we had Rebbes, where we really went into the Talmud, the Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, and we were learning stuff whilst at Haberdashers, evenings, weekends. We belonged to youth movements, very important. So outside of school, we were very much in the Jewish world. So there were worlds that we felt easy to move backwards and forwards into. And you rightly say, when I was on the Jewish Leadership Council some years ago. There were 25 people around the table, and I noticed that 23 of us engaged in community. 23 out of the 25 had gone to non-Jewish schools. Only 2 had gone to Jewish schools. And that's important because they felt community was important for them, so much so they were devoting their life or part of their lives to community. And yet they hadn't suffered as a result of going, I say suffered in inverted commas, and going to non-Jewish schools and being part of a much, much wider world. I, like you, have questions about this closeting of children just in the Jewish world through Jewish schools. Jewish schools have been a great success of the Jewish community in the UK over the last 20 years. The percentage, I believe, that go certainly to primary school is probably 70%, 70 to 80, I believe even 60%. No, maybe less, but certainly we're talking about a very large percentage go to secondary Jewish schools. But they do miss out on something. So there are pros and cons very much of the world that we're in right now. I think the modern Orthodox schools are not too bad at making sure that they expose their students to a much wider culture than just that of the Jewish world. And indeed, they're quite happy to mix the cultures both within the school and taking them out of school time to mix with other people in their charity work, etc. Where I fear there is a problem, and we're seeing it, is the more and more enclosed world of the Haredim, which is the fastest part of the growing Jewish world worldwide, where they have no exposure whatsoever. I remember taking a group of young Haredi children when I was working at Ezra, taking them on an outing into London, and I realized as we were going onto the underground that none of them had been on the underground before. When they got into London, on the rare occasion they'd gone in by car. So we were teaching them how just to do normal things. You meet people sometimes who've come from the Haredi world late in life and have left, and the basic skill sets of going into a cafe or talking to other people, they just don't have it. So there is a problem, but we mustn't lose the sight of the value that we have in the Jewish schools that we've built. There is a way of raising your hand, everybody, which some of you may know about, and I'm thinking maybe that might be a way, but if not, somebody may just want to unmute themselves. I hope everybody won't do it together and ask a question. So does somebody want to ask?
Gillian wants to. Gillian, did you want to ask a question, Gillian?
I thought she put her hand up.
Did you put your? We can't hear you.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
I was the one who was hoping to ask a question. Simon, you're very, very unusual in that you have been able to develop so many different aspects of your character and personality and capabilities in arts and sciences and community work and languages. Some of us lucky ones are able to do one of these. But what I wanted to ask you is, I have had several wonderful grandchildren coming up to teenagers period of their lives. And I was wondering what advice you would give to young people in today's world, how to approach it and how to develop themselves.
Oh, that's a really, really hard question. By the way, Tom has this lovely Hungarian accent. Now, I said my father came from Slovakia, but he spoke Hungarian mother tongue. And my late grandmother, or as we call her, my grandmother, she had a very, very Hungarian accent. She used to tell, she says, you look, Shefele, you look $1 million. So you
Nagy mama.
Nagy mama. Nagy mama. Not that I could speak any Hungarian, but we could bluff it anyway. No, but on the serious point about what to tell children, it's a very difficult time for teenagers because of social media. And this is a world that I'm not exposed to nearly as much as probably some of you through your children. And it's important, I think, just by reading about it, and it's difficult for me to give advice because I really don't take part in Facebook, and where possible, I keep away from the other social. I don't take part in Twitter. And I get by so far anyway, without much of that. They are in that world. It's inevitable they'll be in that world. So they need to be exposed to a wider physical world. We talked about culture before. It would be nice if they could be exposed to some of these more classical cultures, and the young people are seen less and less at concerts. When we were growing up, and indeed later on, one saw a lot of young people going to concerts in a way that we don't see, or didn't see until today. In Israel, I remember young soldiers going to concerts all the time, and that seems to have stopped. And that's a great shame. And I think, obviously, they will be exposed to pop culture, but at the same time, if one can encourage a wider view of the world, I think they would learn a lot from it. It's so much more accessible these days. When it comes to education, people need a broad education as long as possible. They don't need to specialize too early. But when it comes to, they're not clear what they want to study. If they have a skill to understand mathematics, I think mathematics is useful for whatever career you follow, mathematics or science. You can be a lawyer, you can be an accountant, of course, you can become an entrepreneur, you can be even an artist, but if you have a grounding in mathematics, you will know how to solve problems. And I often ask, what should I study, what should I follow? And if they're not clear exactly what to study mathematics. You'll solve problems later on by using your mathematical skills. When I was running Home Choice, when I set up and ran Home Choice TV, we had to solve so many problems, not least of which was it legal? Was the law allowed to run television programs over a telephone wire in the 1990s? It wasn't. And I used the mathematical skills to understand and break that problem up. And also, by the way, I should say thermal skills, because the law could not be, to interpret the law at the time, 1990, you could apply a thing called klalu pratu klau. I won't go into the detail, but it's a lovely thing, maybe subject of a share, and had a big fight with the Independent Television Commission and Oftel at the time, which now both Ofcom, whether these things were legal. But they were skills that you pick up in life. So broad education, and if possible, mathematics or science, at least as part of your education. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody want to unmute and ask a question? Otherwise, we'll close. Okay.
Anyone want to raise their hand? I've got gallery view now.
Oh, gallery view. Is that what I got?
Ah,
Lieselot.
Lieselot.
Liesel.
Hello. I remember Shlomo Levine interviewing your father once. It was a fascinating talk. And your father told that as a side effect of the connection with the wonderful musicians in Russia, that actually he and your mother were helping the diplomatic relationship between Israel and Russia. I wonder if you would like to maybe mention a little of this. Thank you.
Yes, Lisa, that's an interesting question. During the period up to 1967, Israel had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. They became increasingly fraught as the Soviet Union tied itself to the Arab world. And in 1967,
I was going to say just one more question after this.
I think, Tom, you just mute your, that's it. Yeah, if everybody mutes if we're not talking, that's better. And in 1967, they broke diplomatic relations. And that meant that my parents were in a very strong situation because they were beginning to build their relationship with Russia during this period. As you know, with Israel during this period, and of course have been associated with Russia. And until the break with the Russians, which is a story in itself, part of which is to do with the relationship with Jews in Israel, they were able to engage with both sides. I mean, the people in Russia generally were very interested in what Israel did and Israel's achievements, especially the Jews, but not just the Jews. Oistrach was a Jewish musician who was always interested in Israel. So there was an interest in Israel by people that we met. But then there was, as you say, the diplomatic aspects of it. I had a wonderful picture. One of the pictures I was going to show, but I have to try and sort this out, the technology, was a picture of my father with the first Israeli ambassador here to the UK. And they kept very closely in touch with the embassies of both Russia, of the Soviet Union at that time, and Israel. So there was always this way of introducing one to the other. I can't say we're involved in too much of the secret work that went on, which I'm sure went on between Israel and the Soviet Union, but certainly it's been much easier really to relate to the two since the reformation of relations between Israel and Russia in the 1990s, but then the whole story changed anyway. Can you remember the particular incident, Lisa-Lotte,
it must have been many years ago when Shlomo Levin interviewed your father, but you know, it may be 20 years ago already. I don't remember, but I seem to remember actually your father saying that diplomatic letters managed to come also between Britain, as far as I remember, and Russia.
Well, certainly, yes, certainly between Britain and Russia. Culture was considered by the British governments, all the governments at that time, to be an important link with the Soviet Union, even in periods of crisis. We were always concerned that the relationship with the Soviet Union would extend to cultural relations, and but it never did. If some of you remember the 105 spies who were expelled from the Russian embassy, and there was a fear that the cultural relations, in particular this contact with the great musicians and stars, would be broken, but they were not. Culture was always seen as the one link that could go with the two. My father used to take letters to Russia. He would visit members of the Jewish community there. He took small parcels with him. I believe the Russians must have been aware, but anyway, he did it. He wasn't afraid to do it. I have a lovely postcard which he sent from Moscow to us with a picture of the Kremlin. And he says, "Here is the Kremlin of the great Soviet Union." And in Hebrew, here's Yehei Machshamon V'Zichron. May their names and their memories be blotted out. So I don't know whether any censor at the time would have read the Hebrew, but it certainly got through to us. So he had this wonderful dual relationship with them, and was able to link certainly Jewish communities, and that included Israel, with Jews in the Soviet Union. In fact, it was very much that relationship which finally broke the relationship that my parents had with the Soviets in the 1970s, which extended up to perestroika and glasnost in the 1990s. Again, in his interviews and in my mother's interview recently at Southampton, you would have heard more about that.
It's been absolutely fascinating, Simon. Thank you so much. I've loved every minute of listening to you.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you everybody for coming.